Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. I agreed many months ago to participate in the conference. Mark asked, will you speak again at our national security conference? And I said, sure. And then I was stunned to get the email where he had proposed a topic for me, Anglican Statecraft. All right. And then I look at the schedule and I realize I'm after lunch. And then I arrived today and I discover not only am I after lunch, I'm also following the brilliant, eloquent Baptist Paul Miller. So Mark wanted me to speak about, in defense of the established religion of the Church of England, to a bunch of American Baptists in the torpor of lunch after one of the most brilliant defenders of Baptist statecraft. My only conclusion is that Mark truly had it out for me. To which I would remind him that both Charles and John Wesley lived and died Anglicans. And the Methodism is, if anything, a sort of a little brother in the church in the Anglican Communion. Now, I think I have three things to commend my little speech versus my good friend and often debate partner, Paul Miller. The first is that I think what I have to say will be a little bit novel. I had to scratch my head when I was given this topic because there is so little written about what it would mean to have an Anglican statecraft. There's hardly anything about Anglican political theology as such, and at least written recently, there's been some revival thanks to folks like Brad Littlejohn and the Davenant Institute. And anything that I have to say that's good and valuable, you can ascribe to them. Any mistakes or historical errors are my own. So I think what I have to say will be a little bit novel. I think I also have the benefit of being right, or at least being able to poke some holes in some of the things that Paul has said even just now. And then, as is often the case of Anglicans against Baptists, I will speak short where he has spoken long. So, all right, let's get started. I thought I would offer today 4 distinct elements that could be understood to contribute to a distinctly Anglican mode of statecraft. Now, to even speak of an Anglican mode of statecraft is already to gather together a lot of disparate and contradictory themes within the history of the Christian church and the history even of the Anglican church. If Anglicanism is anything, it is and has always been a somewhat discordant mess of people who have found themselves together due to historical circumstances. I actually think this is a beautiful and important and distinctive and valuable part of Anglicanism that I will hope to be able to defend to you later. In addition, I'm going to make these claims in contradiction to, I think, 2 other really important modes of Christian political theology. The Anabaptist Tradition, of which the Baptists are only the more reasonable members. The vast majority of Anabaptists are no longer with us because of some of the extremities and contradictions inherent in Anabaptist theology, perhaps. And on the other hand, the Roman Catholic political theology. So, I was also surprised, by the way, to hear Paul claim the American founding for the Baptists. I think the father of our country, George Washington, might have been a little bit surprised to hear that, as would a significant majority of presidents who have been Episcopalian, Presbyterian, or Methodist. So before I get to what I think are these 4 distinct elements, I wanted to stipulate something that's, I think, distinctive and often difficult to understand about Anglicanism, something which I, as someone who was born and raised a Baptist, had to come to understand, which is to say that it's a distinctly historical way of thinking about the church and the church's life. It doesn't begin from either attempting to find a set of creeds or systematic theology which is held to be completely accordant with Scripture, although certainly there are attempts at theology that is faithful to Scripture, faithful to the Christian tradition, and it doesn't claim to be the sole representation of Christianity on earth. Right? It doesn't claim now. It does claim that the church is a reality on earth, and I think that's an important part of its statecraft, which I'll explain in a second. So the first of these 4 elements I would hold is that Anglican statecraft is realistic about the relationship between faith and the state and faith and the nation. One could say the nation state, although I think one has to immediately bracket that to say not that the nation is something that is sort of transcendent and beyond the people, but the nation as the life of the people, and the state as the magistrate overseeing and responsible for the life of the people. To put it another way, Anglican statecraft takes a high view of the spiritual role of the magistrate. On the one hand, the Anabaptist tradition effectively rejects the spiritual role of the magistrate. It does not necessarily reject, although many Anabaptists do, the role of the state as such, but it rejects the role of the state as teacher or the state as a spiritual or moral exemplar. On the other hand, the Catholic tradition, of course, affirms the spiritual role of the magistrate and holds that by virtue of the spiritual role of the magistrate, the state is subject to the moral and often political power of the Roman Church. Now, I would contend that Anglicanism seeks to preserve what was in fact the medieval consensus around the role of the magistrate. The most anti-Catholic or anti-papist article of the 39 Articles stipulates that the Pope has no authority in the realm of England. That is a direct quote from the Statute of Praemunire, I'm probably mispronouncing that, of 1392. Promulgated 200 years prior to the Reformation, right? So the medieval position, contra the sometimes pronouncements from the Vatican, was that while the Pope enjoyed a moral authority, that political authority and temporal authority necessarily belonged to the particular princes and magistrates of particular states, responsible to particular peoples there. So while the Pope and the Church had this universal jurisdiction, there was a necessarily local, necessarily emplaced tradition or power for the magistrate. But at the same time, it did not reject the spiritual importance of the state and of the magistrate. In other words, Anglican statecraft would hold that state power necessarily intersects with faith and the object of Christian government, which is, of course, the protection of and development of Christians, of a Christian faith, of a society which, even if it does not seek to bring heaven up onto earth, at least seeks to grow in grace. And so that enterprise is inseparable from state power. And any version of any political theology which rejects this is unrealistic and ignores the way in which a so-called secular political theology is in fact simply replaces one faith for another. And I have to say, the passage of history seems to support this notion, that any state which says that it is neutral upon questions of faith and questions of morals will prove itself over time not to be so. Now, the second element of Anglican statecraft I would hold is a freedom of conscience, emphasis on conscience. Freedom of conscience, as the Anabaptists would have it, amounted to a kind of total freedom of subjective moral belief as it relates to matters of worship, but also the matters of life that come out of one's worship. Right? If you look at early Baptists, like the Roger Williams colony here in America, they adopted, and not just them, but also offshoots and splinters and other inevitable elements of Baptist polity. They would adopt stranger and stranger modes of worship and behavior that had serious social implications, as well as serious implications maybe for the development of the Christian faith. So Anglican statecraft, as it develops over time, centers on the fact that the state cannot and will not compel belief. It will respect and acknowledge the breadth of beliefs, and over time, further and further developments of respecting the breadth of forms of worship. But it never backs down from the notion that, again, as the state necessarily has a spiritual role, that it has a role as a teacher. There's this famous saying, of course, lex oriendi, lex credendi. Again, I'm butchering that in my Latin. The law of prayer is the law of belief, right? Or one might even just say the law. Anglican statecraft has emphasized heavily common, public words of worship and a common and accessible public liturgy. It's the Church of England under the sponsorship of King James that creates the King James version of the Bible, which so many Baptists love to use. It is the Church of England that has the Book of Common Prayer, and which allows large amounts of freedom of conscience and freedom of theological belief around the interpretation of the Book of Common Prayer, around British churchmanship. all with one common mode of prayer, a mode of prayer which over time helps foster the spiritual life of the people. There's a reason why throughout the English language around the world, it is phrases from the King James Version of the Bible and from the Book of Common Prayer that form the kind of classic modes of prayer, even in Methodism, even outside of the Church of England, even outside Anglicanism. If you go to a Baptist church and they're trying to have a traditional sounding marriage, they're going to use language from the Book of Common Prayer. And this leads to the third kind of distinctive character of Anglican statecraft, which is its ecumenism. Anglicanism, because it does not hold that it is either the sole receiver of true belief or of or the true life of the church on earth, has been modest in its claims about other forms of Christianity, and has been eager to cooperate with the broader kind of creedal tradition. There's a reason why Mere Christianity was written by an Anglican, C.S. Lewis. From the 16th century on, the Church of England was in communion with many of the other Reformed churches, and has always sought to expand the breadth of its communion under the scope of baptized believers. And so this kind of cooperation, this ecumenism, this modesty, I think, is an important part of Anglican statecraft. It led to and encouraged cooperation on matters of faith, even as the British Empire expanded all over the world. And that leads to, I think, the fourth element of, and of course, I should say, to continue my theme, this is a contrast to either an Anabaptist tradition, which seeks ever more pure expressions of the true creed, of the true belief, or on the other hand, Roman Catholicism, for whom ecumenism is predicated on effectively submitting to the authority of the Pope. And the last distinctive of Anglican statecraft over time, I believe, has been a kind of evangelicalism. Now, you might be surprised to hear that brought up as a form of statecraft, but historically, you can tell a lot about a state's position and about the world order by looking at about the role of missionaries in that order. And I think there's an interesting contrast here. On one hand, based on this ecumenism, the British Empire, as it expands, is open to, again, with possibly some exceptions for Catholic missionaries, is open to missionaries from other branches of nonconformists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, Methodists, etc. And yet, this cooperation is under the aegis of a growing of the Royal Navy and of a growing military power that is nonetheless subservient to the Christian faith and to the tenets of Christian morality as understood and taught by Anglicanism, right? It's no coincidence, right, that the earliest missionaries in West Africa were effectively under the protection of British canons, right? It's no coincidence that the China Inland Mission had at least the implicit protection of the British forces in the region, right? And this had tremendous impact on world history. The political scientist Robert Woodbury published a really important article a few years ago called "The Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy," that showed that the single greatest predictor of whether a developing state would achieve liberal democracy was the presence of what he called conversionary Protestants, right? Again, implicitly, he didn't say this, most of the time protected by the British state and in its imperial form. What was distinctive about these conversionary Protestants is because they were serious about evangelism, because they were serious about a form of Christianity based on freedom of conscience that emphasized conversion, interior conversion, again, perhaps with some of the pressure from the nonconformists, from the Puritans. So emphasized real interior conversion based around a high view of language, a high view of the Bible, a high view of common forms of prayer, right? Whenever missionaries, English-speaking missionaries went, they stood up colleges, they stood up printing presses, they educated, and it's that kind of infrastructure that over many hundreds of years was very strongly correlated with having a stable democracy today. So if you ask, having been asked to look at the last 400 years of history and trying to see in that fog some clear themes of what could be described as an Anglican statecraft. That is what I've come up with. So I will end there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. My name is Alex. I'm from Colorado Christian University, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on your last point. I think that's something that I often wrestle with, and just being here at this conference, talking about the various subjects that we've talked about, I think that's an important point that you made, that missionaries have influenced politics to that degree, and also states.
Yeah, I think missionaries influence politics. Missionaries moderated, the historic record declares missionary activity moderated other forms of avarice rooted in greed and power politics that were kind of byproduct of empire, including in the sort of new imperialism of the 19th century. Missionary activity was an important motivator of European society kind of going out into the world, but it took very many different forms, right? And again, this is a value judgment, as it were, but I can't help but think that the version of it that we saw in Anglicanism was one of the, in the long view, one of the one that struck a better balance between the real need to convert, the real, the sense that Christianity is in fact true, that it's God's desire for every human to enter into relationship with him through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. That's true. On the other hand, we can't force that upon people, and to use violence to achieve that is also wrong, right? And again, to go back to my vague kind of Anabaptist versus Catholic contrasts, I think the Anabaptist position, which of course emphasizes emphasis of evangelism, doesn't have very much to say to the problem that Christianity truly is a revolutionary message, and Christianity, as it was spreading throughout the world, again, largely, in retrospect, as part of this broader European expansion, it encountered serious political resistance. Missionaries were killed. Missionaries were suppressed. Christians were persecuted and martyred and suppressed, right? And so I think we should take seriously the notion that some measure of actual state power employed to protect missionaries or protect converted Christians was justified. And I think that's what Anglicanism largely did. It also was responsible for abolition, right? It was British warships that broke the back of the slave trade in West Africa. So that's a kind of contrast to the Anabaptist position. On the other hand, there is, both because of this ecumenism and because of this emphasis on freedom of conscience, there was more hesitance about about a kind of you might call it integralism, but a version of state power that projected both the power of the institutional church and the power of the state at the same time, right? So most of this evangelism was not part of British state efforts, right? It was missionary societies and sort of civil society, religious societies, but it was under the protection of the British Empire. So that's a kind of, again, a maybe controversial way of putting it, but I think a distinctive element of Anglican statecraft.
Can I ask you a second question?
Please, yeah.
What do you see the future of that?
Well, I should say that, this is a kind of retrospective. I think Anglicanism today looks very different. Anglicanism today, largely because of this history, is much more centered in the global South, which I think is all great. I think there's a lot of tensions between the Church of England, the Episcopal Church, and and GAFCON and sort of the African Church. So it's hard to say what the future of this enterprise is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Nate from Liberty University. I had a quick question. Do you see America as kind of, it's less so now, but in the unipolar sense that was post-Cold War, do you see that hegemonic power as kind of fulfilling the same thing in our ability to influence nations to release missionaries like Pastor Brunson and stuff like that? Do you see that as kind of fulfilling the same role as British warships did in the 19th century?
Yeah. I think I was thinking while I was listening to Paul talk that I'd want to think more about where the United States fits in this story after it kind of takes the place of Great Britain as a kind of global hegemon. The protection of missionaries has been a steadfast component of European diplomacy since 15th century, actually going back to the Crusades. So I do think that is an important part of international law and diplomacy that continues to this day, and that, as you said, the United States continues to play a role, especially now as a kind of advocate of religious freedom. I think it matters that the world's most powerful country is also the biggest advocate of religious freedom.
Hi, my name is Gio from the University of Dallas. My question for you was related to the second question that was asked.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think this vision of Anglican statecraft will divide the Anglican communion? Because I'm a Catholic who used to be Episcopalian, and I did see sort of more of a trend away from, like, what you said, like the medieval Christianity and kind of that tradition, but whereas in other parts of the Anglican communion, that's not really the case. I mean, so what?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I forgot to mention, the kind of exemplar of Anglican statecraft is not a theologian or anything. Of course, it's Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Long may she reign. She's the only remaining anointed Christian monarch of Europe. No Catholic countries actually anoint their monarchs anymore. Her religion, as far as anyone knows, is very prayer book, very simple yet devout. To me, that's kind of the exemplar. I think the fact that we can't be certain what will happen under her son or grandson, I think says a lot about the uncertainty of the future of Anglican statecraft. I certainly wouldn't want to hold against the possibility of serious revival in the Church of England, of serious return to orthodoxy, but that's not foreordained. So I do think it's very much in question. Yeah, I mean, certainly if the Church of England and the African Church, African Anglican Church is sort of schism, I think that the African churches at least will continue some of this model of Anglican statecraft, and that the Church of England would sort of descend back into just being another national church. It wouldn't have this maybe slightly broader vision of itself. Yeah.
John, is it too early to assess the influence of Anglican statecraft in Africa, which is where most Africans now live?
Most Anglicans now live? To assess the impact
The
is...
political impact of Anglicanism in Africa.
I mean, I think it's still maybe a little bit early. Nonetheless, I do think it's really interesting to see the important, impactful, yet moderating force that most Anglican clerics and most Anglican bishops have in African politics, right? I think, look, I mean, if you go back to the end of the apartheid movement, right? You go back to any of these major elements of decolonization, I think Anglican church leaders have been extremely important at finding a political middle ground, about calling sides that were heading towards civil war back towards reconciliation with tremendous moral authority. I mean, that to me is very much in line with Anglican statecraft. Yeah.
Anybody else? Thank you, John.